A deadly home invasion, a shocking betrayal. This true horror story will haunt you. Welcome to Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell before the nightmares find you. The 20th of June 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Caneva. The wiry silver, mustached, 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made 2 sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you can, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks 2 decades ago. His marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd upended his life and moved from California to Florida, finding a new job. There had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again too. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with a car and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance, and Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. That day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet felt a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband Roe had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Roe had given her right next to the inexpensive topaz, one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California, and they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband Roe, had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant. Roe had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left, and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry, looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror. Lake Janet's spacious 1-story house was at the very end of the road with a red back door, looking out to the water. Her late husband Roe had lived there with his first family before he met Janet. And then Janet lived there throughout their marriage, and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house initially, Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Rose's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home after dinner. Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog Kissy while they watched some local news. And then, around 11 p.m., She remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep. So Janet switched off the television and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing, Janet knew she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees. While twisting at her neck, Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling, trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, but by this point, she was exhausted and disoriented. And slowly, everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room, and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something, a hoarse, raspy, wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from, or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away. Right now, painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor Kathy looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloodied that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital. And not a moment too soon, even as the EMTs loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry, and his face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees peering under the bed when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified, her eyes were dilated, like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital. And as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up, and two men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Mooney, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division, who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. Henry's wallet, with some money and credit cards in it, was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead. So Detective Mooney headed out to the backyard, where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Mooney went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer, and after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had two pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them, but the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person aside from the killer who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so Brewer and Mooney were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited fixed budget, but in reality he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detectives speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money, and their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Neva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by
the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Mooney knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder since they were across the country in California when it happened, but that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father, and both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father, and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman, but they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he'd built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused, because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David. And Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret, and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister Sharon, detectives Brewer and Mooney got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning, and during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much, or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake, where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on television on Father's Day, which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detective suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father David, was what? Suddenly spending lots of time with him. Was he trying to get Henry's money? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home, and also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night, and while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Mooney knew she could just be lying for him. So ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie, and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative, and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other 2 children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all 3 kids together. And right away, Brewer and Mooney could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry.
Spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed. It was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Mooney decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Red said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together, just from the number of cars Henry had sold. As one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm. Henry Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark Red. That Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point, he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off, and soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Red didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing. But Red said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesman and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict, and that was why he disappeared sometimes. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, detectives Brewer and Mooney tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. Said he did not know anything about Henry's murder. He also said that, yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king, simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Mooney found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene, fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment, and it was clean of prints. But Mark didn't know that, and if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make, but instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect, because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves, just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was, and sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation, but Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Mooney just sat there. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped. Janet was not just beaten up, She was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Mooney gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure. And then, a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground hearing this horrible rattling, wheezing sound to help jog her memory. Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still, she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her 2 rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more, but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the 3 Ka children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David. But, as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory. And so the investigation began to go cold. Then in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they'd had to break up a fight at home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whitley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leela Hages, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leela had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest, and so he shouted that Leela had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing, Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that 2 rings had been taken from the crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this specifically, John might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Mooney got word about John and Leela, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So, out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack. So Brewer and Mooney came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point, they were willing to try anything. And Janet was on board. So the next day, the detectives returned now with a hypnotist who put Janet into a trance. And then, while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly, it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large, shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet trying to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were 2 attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death. as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David Jeff, and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leila, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark the salesman, who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detectives still had no idea who he would have worked with that night. After leaving the hospital, Brewer and Mooney holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Mooney stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word, buried in one of the suspects' files. I showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry Caneva and Janet Scott on the night of the 20th of June, 1997. A little before 3 a.m., two figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog Kissy was lying at her feet when the killers entered. The dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, and they were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep. So they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free, and one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. And as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times, and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said that should do it. As they climbed off of her, the killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go on their way out, though the accomplice spotted Janet's rings sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant, and the sight of it made them furious. So the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room, along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness, feeling excruciating pain across her body. She could hear the strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could be. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember, until her hypnosis session, that she'd actually been attacked by two people, and that one of them was somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whitley and Leila Hodes, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Mooney had suspected, these two did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry, it was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet, She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leela was the daughter of Janet's late husband Roe from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake, where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when her dad died. Leela felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leela's mother, which means all along the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was, and Leela's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Mooney put this all together, they had John and Leela arrested. John's DNA was tested, and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette butt that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leela was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leela. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog Kissy would make a full recovery and lived long, happy life.